Welcome to the neophytes of narratology, the internet's most pretentious and pseudo-intellectual pursuit since, perhaps, Nietzsche's thus podcast Zarathustra, or Camus' renowned vlog of Sisyphus. While lesser men aspire to stand on the shoulders of mere giants, we at the Lost Signals will accept nothing less than titans. So join us as we delve into the fundamentals of narrative nuance and critique the critics who proclaim to know the universal qualities of effective storytelling.
That outburst to Ian. How come one? Alright, hang on. Here we go. 5, 4, 3.
Hello and welcome to Neophytes of Narratology. I'm going to give you a brief warning that all of us are kind of
It's been a long 24 hours, folks.
Yeah. That it has. And the energy is probably going to be pretty low for this one, which is unfortunate because it's an interesting topic. But we'll be there in a second. I'm Jonathan Ian Manzer, here with Scott Thurla.
At least that's what I tell you guys.
And Stephen Amosi.
How's everybody doing?
Yeah.
Good?
So we're doing a work called Identity as Narrative, Prevalence, Effectiveness, and Consequences of Narrative Identity Work in Macro Work Role Transitions by...
Got all that?
I'm going to apologize to them because I'm going to screw up the names. Herminia Ibarra Insead and Roxana Barbulescu. However you pronounce that.
Sure.
Nonetheless, I apologize again. So what this is dealing with is, in a way, how we create identities for work, but the majority of it's actually the mechanics of how we create identities through narrative.
In general, in social interaction to ourselves and with others.
So, Scott, do you have any beginning thoughts?
Well, kind of. I'll just give you my personal narrative that, yes, because of my situation and currently in the real world as it relates to my day job, if you will,
Yes.
that I sort of like connected a bit to it because it was framed through that. But no, I mean, we've discussed a little bit of similar things previously on Neophytes, and this is somewhat not quite within the unreliable banner, but like sort of related to it. Just how people, the stories they tell themselves internally to generate the image of who they are, and then that's presented to peers and so forth. And this specifically, the framework is like, for example, career changes. So I think the example they use is a banker is going to become a candle maker. How does he then rewrite the narrative of his identity and self in his own internally, and then sort of justify it, if you will, to those who he is presenting that new image to, which is pretty interesting. And sort of delving into mechanics of how people reinvent and reinterpret and edit, if you will, their own self-narrative stories.
And I'm very interested in how, and this is why I'm kind of going in this direction, why I kind of started the unreliable narrator aspect of the Neophytes in Narratology, was that I'm interested in personal narratives and how we shape our own lives. And this was right up my alley for discussing how that might work.
Sorry, go on. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Yeah, you sound like you're drawing in your breath.
He was going to present a narrative himself.
I was, but I thought you might have been done, but it seemed like you weren't.
Please.
Take it away.
Well, I'm going to provide the second disclaimer, an addendum disclaimer to your previous disclaimer, in that, while I think this is a fascinating topic, I have actually not read this paper. So kind of what I'm going to be looking to you two for on this, because I do want to get involved in talking about it, is you're kind of going to have to teach me what is in this. I've read a little bit of it. I read the first few pages, and I just didn't get to finish it, unfortunately. So I am going to go back and read it eventually after this episode. But in the meantime, help me out. Tell me what it's all about.
Actually,
Sure.
This is interesting because this goes back to our previous discussion on unreliable narrators. I'm tired, and so I am one variety of unreliable narrator is that I'm going to fail to provide by my own action all the information necessary. You, on the other hand, are the uninformed,
Right.
unreliable narrator. So you're going to provide information that's wrong because you just don't have the knowledge of it. So we're both aspects
I'm
of that.
semi-informed. I'm somewhere between those two things. Sure.
So on to
Papa bear, mama bear, baby bear type situation
Exactly.
is what
Kind
we're
of,
dealing
yes.
with here.
So let me be your unreliable narrator. I'm going to start off with a quote of it. We propose a dynamic model by which successful stories, those that generate feelings of authenticity and are deemed valid by their target audience, are more likely to be retained or embellished for future use. When stories are unsuccessful in contract, we postulate that a person will seek alternative narratives. So what they're suggesting, and a lot of times they do reiterate points often in this work, is that we have a store of stories, if you will, that we tell about our lives.
Story store.
Sort of wheelhouse, if you will, yes.
And that, in a sense, like, you know how Locke described identity as like the memory over time? I think this one is suggesting that it's not necessarily the memories, in a way, are unimportant. It's the narrative we develop
Based
from our
off of
past
them.
histories. And that at points, the narratives that we have and the stories we tell are useful because they fit in with where we are in the world, the people we interact with. And then all of a sudden a life event will happen. They are focused heavily on work. So they're saying that, for instance, if you get a promotion, well, if you're in a managerial position when you were in a lower segment, you might not share the same everyday stories you did as you used to. Because as manager, you now have responsibility over
Your role
people.
is different,
Yes.
so your identity sort of slightly shifts.
Yes. But the idea is that it doesn't shift too much because it's the natural progression that you were supposed to go on.
Exactly.
That society deems you worked at this position, you got a higher position within the company, or so on. So yes, based on your peers, your stories will change, but your internal stories don't change much.
It's still
because
pretty
it's
cemented.
Yeah, I mean, like there's that slight shift, but however, if you get fired from a job, or actually they bring up besides the kennel maker, they say so a stockbroker in New York all of a sudden becomes a Buddhist monk. That's to society not a story we tell
use
in society.
institutionalized progression or something like some term like
that's
that.
a personal, or it's not a societal story. It's more of a personal. Like,
Well, the thing is,
to an extent.
it rejects the society story.
Yeah.
This is not what people are supposed to do as society claims it. So their story has to change to fit their new narrative. And their stories have to, in a sense, radically change in a way to fit in with, like...
To sort of redraw the parameters of identity. In a sense.
And in their narrative changing, in their story changing, that is a redrawing of the way that they view themselves.
Yes.
Right? It's the idea of, your own personal story radically altering.
Right, which you then take and present to those society at large around you.
Right.
So I'll answer your question with a bunch of quotes from here.
Sure. Can't wait.
There's a shared agreement that identities are multiple, mutable, and socially constructed. That shared agreement means that within the scholars working on this. But coexist within a self that integrates diverse experiences into a unity. Identity work has been defined as people's engagement in forming, repairing, maintaining, strengthening, or revising their identities. Forms of identity work vary, ranging from displays of dress, office decor, and personal objects to such cognitive strategies as ideological reframing and selective social comparison, searching for optimal balance among multiple identities, and using a variety of rhetorical devices, including accounts, stories, justifications, disclaimers, and other vocabularies of motives to express the identity problem the individual is facing. So, we actually had this discussion prior about like a kind of idea I was working with, which is the idea of relational identity between people, and that in a way your identity is formed by the relations you have with everyone else around you. They're kind of the reverse solipsism. in a way. So this here has a kind of similar thing. It's not that each person, but it's that you might have a narrative as a family man. You might have a narrative as a business giant. You might have a narrative as a podcaster. And all those can be true at once, but they all conflict in a certain way. Right. And it's balancing all of the narratives out to make a cohesive individual.
Exactly, and that's the point I was trying to get to, or was going to also build upon, was the cohesiveness of it. So you have, like, I think the metaphor I came up with, the paper doesn't use this one, but Ian and I think we were talking about it yesterday precast, that it's almost like, think of it, Steve, sort of like Legos, where you have this one piece. So when I'm building this certain type of identity, I use this one, but in other situations it doesn't fit, so I have to replace it or modify it with a different piece. And then that creates the identity and the sense of cohesive self, even though some of them might be at odds in certain sectors, we'll say. But nevertheless, I think they use the term authenticity as well.
Yeah, we're going to be getting to that.
Yeah, right. So like that's sort of another angle to it. But it's more or less, yeah, like, so I have an identity as X to Z category, you know, Z other social community. But then I have another one to another sector, which may be, if not radically different, just different enough that they will seem at odds, but there's some general or broad crossover to the identity at whole that still is cohesive, as the paper points out.
Right. So though they're at odds, they still form,
yes,
combine together to form the whole.
Yeah, exactly.
And I mean, that's it's not mind blowing or anything, but I think it's an important thing to like state, right? Like, and an important thing to confirm. As far as something like this goes, because that's kind of what people are. It's collaboration of just somewhat, not necessarily all perfectly conforming to the whole that a person is. It's the whole duality of man thing, sir.
The what? No, you're right. And I got just another quick thing. Ian and I were pre-discussing that it's sort of like, it might seem obvious, but until stated, like, you're like, yeah, it's not, like you said, not mind blowing, but like, yeah, that is true. Like, that's how it works, more or less.
So, we'll get to this part now. Why not? Because it's similar to this. The idea of that, a lot of, I like the discussion most when they're talking about, in a sense, the extremes of it. Because again, when you're dealing with the natural progression of things as society, it's non-controversial. What I think is interesting is the idea of narrative transformation when something unexpected happens.
Right.
So all of a sudden you get demoted at work.
Like me.
Yes. You have to justify in your own mind, with your own narrative, why that occurred.
It's the company's bullshit.
And that's the thing is, I don't know if they bring this up. I forget, but like that's actually a fair thing. Is like making the company the enemy and lowering them to lessen the impact, and to save your own face, is kind of the one narrative structure you can go for it. You can also say, well, perhaps it was meant. This is not what I was meant to do. Let me go and pursue something else.
And you
like
sort of
another narrative.
And then you have to sort of rectify like those two identities.
Right.
To be clear, I didn't quite get demoted, but it felt like a demotion in my own day job. But
this isn't a personal.
That's neither here nor there. True.
This is a personal affront to you.
Like I said, like I sort of like I was viewing it through that lens.
Yeah.
Through maybe the first third of the paper when I was reading it, since they had mentioned work role transitions.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Okay, so we're going to get into the authenticity and validation aspect now. This is going to the mechanics of how a personal narrative works.
Okay.
All right. So authenticity is being true to oneself, however, is a dynamic process whereby a person remains faithful to oneself as self-same, yet changes within the cohesion of lifetime. The desire to construe oneself as a constant and consist over time also implies attempts to achieve ideal and desired future selves. Emotional discomfort arises when people are unable to draw a continuous link between old and new selves, leaving them feeling inauthentic or devoid of an enduring sense of self. And so, again, authenticity is dealing with the inner self, as you just heard there. I thought it was very interesting with because obviously narrative deals with causal chains, as we've studied greatly, and that failure to create a coherent causal chain. Because, all right, I'm going to go, I guess, fourth wall here,
Sure.
and say, like, we just recorded 3 billboards in Ebbing, Missouri.
Outside of Ebbing, Missouri, yeah.
And that was a very like storytelling. But the thing is, like, it was a bunch of people trying to, in a sense, like, in life you have that chaos. And you have that, you don't have the strict narrative chains that you'd want in a story.
Yeah.
So it's interesting, the fact is, if you can't rationalize in your own mind a logical explanation for your own narrative, I could see that, like, creating a lot of distress.
Then a discomfort
Yeah.
along with that. Yeah, for sure. And I think that's what the passage pretty much points out.
Yeah, but I think that human beings have a tendency to create that regardless of how disparate those things are, right? Like,
well, that's kind of why, because you don't want to feel discomfort and emotionally distraught over it, if you will.
Precisely. And like that's...
But it can get outlandish at that point,
perhaps
too.
That's what this is saying. Yeah, of course, but it's never outlandish to you, but when you're... Perhaps if you're explaining this to someone else, or like, you're saying your life story to someone else and you're making connections that are ridiculous, someone else can see that, but theoretically you can't...
They're not as ridiculous or ridiculous at all.
Distinguish those very own, discrepancies in your own narrative, right?
Yeah. Well, that's where validation comes in.
Okay.
Where that is the you telling your story to people and then having... So, if you tell a joke and no one laughs to it, obviously
something
you're never saying that again.
Or, well, sort of. I was going to go into... So it builds off, sort of bridges from this point, or branches off, that is, that like the feedback you receive from those in your general social sphere, that based on that feedback, whether positive or negative, like, you will then adjust the sort of your self-narrative and the way you present it.
Theoretically, but there are a lot of strange branches that are witnessed within humanity. Going back to talking about 3 billboards, there were 2 jackasses that were sitting behind us that were not taking social cues at all and not shutting up throughout the entire movie, despite the fact that people shushed them.
Or perhaps purposely ignoring them.
One person, who shall remain nameless, sitting directly to the right of me, told them to shut the fuck up in the middle of the theater. But, like, that's the thing. Like, you are supposed to take these social cues and, like, adjust your self-narrative, and a lot of people just don't do that.
That's actually a very fair point. But here's the thing is, it goes to, as a possible explanation for this, it goes to tribalism in a way. And I think they actually bring it up quite a bit, that, if someone says, I'm just saying, like, that's an ugly shirt to you, and you don't know that person, you might be like, someone, like, you might not exactly take their criticism to heart. If someone you're very good friends with brings you aside and, like, really, like, that shirt is an ugly...
That shirt is illegal in several states.
Like, you might lend more credence to that. So the idea is that...
I mean, there's other ways to look at that, too. Like, it all depends on the context of what that person is saying. And that's their own... That's their own self-narrative influencing. Like, if I say to you, like, in the middle of a crowd, if I pull you aside and say, that's an ugly shirt, you know that I'm being serious. But if I say to you in the middle of a crowd, that's an ugly shirt, right? There I'm being sarcastic.
That point taken, I'm saying that if...
There's always going to be social context
to it. If I shushed the man behind us, and his friend shushed him, I think that would have... His friend shushing would have held more weight.
Sure.
Of course.
Than my shushing. And that's the point I was trying to make.
Okay.
No, you're right,
so, there's that level of... So like... And when you tell your stories, when you tell your narratives, you will take the feedback from the audience, adjust it. You'll naturally adjust it for crowds as well, so you won't tell it the same way to your family as you will to your boss, as you will to a coworker. And you'll get rid of stories that no longer work in your life. You will, if a story you didn't think was funny, or a good anecdote, all of a sudden, like, you get a good response by the new set of friends.
And you'll bring it back and tweak it.
That's your number one story now.
Now it's my story now.
So it's a combination of authenticity within oneself and validation from others. So that's their whole argument.
Yeah, and I did like that little portion of the article. It was quite well done. Big span, like, that's the major point of it. And like we said, we enjoy delving into that kind of angle of presenting your narrative to yourself and then to others and adjusting as needed or as cued to you by the responses.
Yeah, and I mean that's. I think that's interesting. An interesting topic to go into. And, whatever. I don't have anything. I'm sorry. I didn't read it. I didn't read it. I'm sorry.
His self-narrative.
We basically covered everything they did. It's a fairly short section.
I'm the audience surrogate here. We'll call it that.
Right.
But no, it is interesting. So they say, like, the cap it off, having a story that's not just authentic, but also credible, which is the validation, especially critical and convincing gatekeepers. And I guess important people within your life and all of that. Because, no one wants to be caught being the liar, and all your credibility is gone. So it moves on to the next part, which is also, again, about the mechanics of it, which is first a coherent self-narrative depicts a career as a series of unfolding events that make sense sequentially, in which the protagonist's agency provides a key narrative thread or causal explanation for the story's events. Second, a legitimate self-narrative embeds the individual story in a culturally accepted discourse, facilitating the identity's granting. Third, a negotiated storytelling process creates conditions for the story's social validation by involving its audience. As I said, it tends to cover ground over again because they just did the validation and third validation again. But no, so like you're dealing with coherence. Of course, you want your stories to make sense. They're saying like
to be able to be followed, right? Pretty much.
So this is the first part they say is plot structure is very important to your personal narrative, and they bring up one of our favorite Hero of a Thousand Faces guy.
Joseph Campbell.
Joseph Campbell.
Yeah, they have a quote from Joseph Campbell in there, but yeah, actually right there.
All right, I just didn't remember reading it. I believe you, of course.
But so they bring up, like, in a sense, plot structure, which we have already delved into. Again, I don't know how true that the three-act structure is important in a personal narrative.
Well,
is that what it says?
It doesn't. I don't think
it's at one point it says that three-act structure.
It does mention that specifically. Okay, I don't remember that either.
Again, though, I can see why they would say that. Although I think it's more nitpicky for me to say. Well,
I think it's an easy pointer to that they can use.
Well, I think it's just fitting what you right. Like a lot of times, putting something into that three-act structure is fitting what you know and what you expect into the box that you're used to.
Yeah,
you know.
Good phrase.
And like so, it's you go on the quest. You go through all the trials. You have your lower, like again, the Campbellian
go on the road to trials
cycle,
and so forth.
Right? Now they're on the road to trials, obviously.
But you go into like that. Again, they say through the career angle here. And actually, if you remember the Elizabeth Camp, what we did,
yes, I do.
Where like.
Check that episode out.
Yeah, it's the narrative autobiography. Yeah, and looking back, like, I was always meant to become a poet. I was always meant to be a writer.
I actually, when I saw what this one was about, I connected those two.
You thought of Camp?
Because that one's all about the autobiography, and this is about the personal narrative, right?
Yes,
like
I didn't, but you're right.
They're very
it seems pretty clear, now that you mention it. Yeah.
So, but here's what's interesting: is the protagonist agency that goes into it. And this is where they bring up the Buddhist monk. When you tell a story about, like, and again, they're bringing this more towards, because when you're along the society's deemed path, you don't have to argue much for agency.
Mm-hmm. Your narrative is sort of more accepted, like it's easily fit into the box you were just saying.
But when you decide to become a Buddhist monk or commit a crime,
as you do,
as one might do,
you have to come up with
you have to work harder to
story that people buy.
Exactly, will be cohesive and authentic
to your agency. Mm-hmm. So there's that.
So there's that.
Agentic protagonists help the audience approve of the storyteller's actions and identify with him or her. In studies of the persuasiveness of movie scripts, for example, protagonists who change and grow throughout the movie are assessed more favorably by the public than those who remain static, of course. But nonetheless, the same thing is that you do want to grow. Let's see what else is in here. Legitimacy, again, we brought that up already. But
Nothing is.
They
Let's
cover
see what
it,
else is in here.
I'm not on my top game right now. I don't have a good story for why. It's just a lot of.
Yeah, we sort of do.
Yeah, we should make up a story for a while.
Yeah,
We should just spend the rest
I'll
of this
invent a self-narrative to explain why I'm...
podcast talking about what we've all gone through in the last 24 hours.
And involved a lot,
We have to make it epic.
and involved a lot of drinking and a lot of hanging out. I have to tell you. It was Thanksgiving, by the way. Happy Thanksgiving, people.
All right, so this one's interesting.
That's what we were doing last night.
Go on, I'm sorry.
Stories told in familiar, culturally accepted plots and containing archetypal characters are more convincing than stories that do not follow agreed upon cultural rules. I like that. And I wonder, so of the people, like, what character, archetypal characters do you know in real life?
Wow.
I know a
Put
few,
me
I
on the
guess.
spot, I suppose. Am I supposed to name them? Am I outing people right now?
I want to know all the tricksters around
Who's
me.
what's archetype? Like, I could probably, like, again, to tie it in a bit, point you to some characters at work that would fall into archetypes. And that's it.
Actually,
Let's not do this.
I am going to do this, though. But just one guy.
Go ahead.
Your brother, Mike.
Okay.
Okay.
I hope this is flattering.
No, it is. Look, Mike.
Even though
So-
he's never going to listen to it.
But like when we tell stories involving Mike, it's always in a sense like of course this is how Mike is. He plays, but like this is what Mike would do in that situation. He plays not a one-dimensional archetype. I don't mean it by that, but like he plays
He
a
fulfills this
character
role,
archetype
yes.
of like the stoic kind of guy who and
he's like the silent hero.
Yeah.
Like,
Exactly. He's the quiet cool from, if you know that from whatever movie.
it's cool having
Every
the-
single one of my
yeah.
friends thinks my brother is cooler than and better than me. By the way,
That's true.
True.
But it's like this thing is like when I think of stories about Mike, he has become a character archetype,
right? Yeah.
and it's interesting upon reflection over how we define people by certain traits, no matter how complex they might be.
Uh-huh.
Sure.
And,
You're sort of making them fit into a narrative that is presented to you, or the one that you are working with at least, and then fitting it into your own one,
Mhm.
like
Yeah.
relationship wise, as you mentioned earlier, a relative, narrative, if you will.
I've never been able to pin down what I think Mike's self narrative is.
Silent hero.
I have a good idea for like most of my friends, and like I live with Mike, and I've known him since he was a baby,
Literally since he was born.
since the day he was born. I
Yes.
was there, and I cannot pin down what I think his self narrative is.
Mhm.
He's a mysterious stranger from Fallout.
And like,
Just shows up, helps you out, and then disappears.
I'm sure it's as complex as everybody else's, but like, and he's got this. But you're right, like. Everybody's like, "Oh yeah, Mike. When did that cool guy Mike coming back around?" I'm like, "Fuck you guys, I'm here."
Sorry,
Look
dude.
at my little brother over here.
You have to, here's what you should do, Steve. You should hijack what you think Mike's self-narrative is and apply it to you, so therefore you can adjust
I've got my own self narrative going.
All right.
a
anyway.
strong self narrative at the moment.
Mhm.
Actually, this one's pretty neat. So the next part is audience participation,
Mhm.
which we don't have any of. Thanks, audience.
Audience, talk to us, please.
Leave a couple of comments if you want.
So they actually bring up Alcoholics Anonymous, which I'm sure at least one of us will be in the near future.
No way, man.
Uh,
I don't have a drinking problem at all. Go on.
yes.
Jesus.
But no, they're talking about how that, which is that, like, in a sense, it's a continuous audience feedback over
Yeah.
them honing down a newcomer's identity
Mhm.
to fit in
To the
with
established
their
framework, essentially. Right.
narrative,
Yeah.
because that's how they know how to help people. And it's such an like I don't have anything against that, really. Actually, I mean,
It's a fine
yeah.
structure.
but like that does happen. Like two people's narratives are clashing constantly and shaping each other over the course of time.
I like that, yeah.
So
Sure.
yeah, that's that part of this thing.
Moving on.
That's- Sorry, I'm so cavalier about this.
yes.
We're inventing our self-narrative as we go
I
along.
love the structure of this so far.
So This section is entitled Evolution of Narrative Repertoire and Consequences for Work Role Transition Outcomes. So,
should I speak about that? I got a couple of things to.
yeah, go ahead. If you want.
So like that's I think this is where when I was first reading the article, this is where I came up with the concept of the Lego kind of thing I mentioned to you guys earlier, where you have a set of like basically individual tools, which are the stories and like the anecdotes sort of that you mentioned earlier, and then you sort of apply, you sort of build them around each other, and then apply it to whatever situational role you seem to find yourself in, and then tweak it based on, like we said, feedback and whether or not it feels authentic again to you or to the audience and so forth. And then going forward, you will then adjust that overarching narrative, but tweaking little pieces of them here and there.
Right.
So what they're discussing, in a sense, that store of stories, that repertoire of narrative.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And saying that we have all these stories
from which
within
to
our
draw
heads,
from. Yeah.
And yeah, like I said, like a thing like, oh, this no longer fits. We snap this off, put this one in there, and you have like a kind of a ammo store of stories that you can continually modify.
Yeah, and some you discard.
I like all these analogies.
It's
what
like,
I came up with.
I agree with a lot of what they have to say. But it's sort of like the most boring video game mechanic. Tweak the story, put it in as ammo. There,
Sure.
All right, so people acquire and develop discursive elements of their narrative repertoires directly through interactions with others and indirectly through their participation in a range of cultural activities such as reading fiction and biography and watching film or the news, as well as via their sense-making efforts in the wake of significant events. So I'm going to actually... I crossed this one, which means that I wanted to definitely read this. As discussed above, people evaluate narrative identity work episodes based on their internal authenticity and external validation criteria. People compare the identity negotiated in the narrative form with their private representations of the kind of person they really are, and really's in quotes, or would like to be. A self-narrative episode that reaffirms or clarifies personal self-conceptions is more likely to create the conditions for perpetuating the self-narrative in further interactions than the one that does not. By the same token, people evaluate their stories by gauging their audience's reaction. Audiences affect the fate and evolution of a self-narrative by validating or failing to endorse its premise, and by providing feedback about how to improve the story. Authenticity and validation criteria are related, since how others see us matters for how we ultimately come to see ourselves. When communicators experience their message as creating a shared reality with the audience, they see the message as more reliable and more valid. In the course of work role transition-related episodes, stories that feel authentic and are validated are more likely to be told again in future episodes than stories that feel contrived or do not meet audience approval. Which is, I think, a nice summary of everything they brought up.
It's all logical and makes sense for sure. Again, that's one of those things that once you read it, like, yeah, that seems so fucking obvious, but it may not be until stated as such in such a way.
And the next, I just want to quickly say, the next section is kind of talking about the benefit and pitfalls of having a lot of stories,
right?
And especially the conflict that can come in when you have
so much stuff.
Actually, I think I forgot to bring up this point, which is when you update stories, an individual story, you also have to update every story that affects.
Yeah.
Because you want consistency amongst characters and how they act. So if all of a sudden I start to hate Steve-O over yonder...
Standard.
Yeah.
What do you mean all of a sudden?
Every week this happens.
Like I will have to. All of a sudden, if I said like a story about like a wonderful time we had together, that wouldn't fit in with the narrative. I have to change I have to change or get rid of that story completely.
Say, or you'd have to say, remember when we used to have wonderful times, and now you suck.
Yeah,
pretty much. Yes,
that's true. So that's So you have to. You with the greater things, you have more chances of conflict in stories and everything that comes with having more of things you have to remember and make sure that there's no
The more
conflict.
Lego pieces you have, you got to keep them all organized.
Yeah.
Remember which
'Cause
ones are which.
you don't want pirates fighting knights.
Yeah, it doesn't make any
Like,
sense,
yeah,
man. Like, it's incoherent.
You see, it doesn't make any sense. You see,
The dragon and the robot are it's
Yeah,
off.
you can't
it's all
tell
off. Yeah.
an A
But,
story and a B story that
however-
completely at odds.
what? Wait, what were the examples? Pirates and
Knights.
knights fighting would be awesome.
Yeah, I'm not saying it's not in theory, but
Don't act like that wouldn't be awesome.
listen,
You're like a child playing with Legos.
yeah.
I'll say
Who
this.
doesn't want the awesome shit that children think of to play with Legos?
I'll give you one.
Pirates fighting knights, man. That's fucking great.
I made it happen when I was a kid. I had both pirate Legos and knight Legos, and they had a battle. Again, it doesn't make any sense per se, but it was fun.
Can
I'll give you
we? Oh no, it's not. I thought it was the. I thought that was the exact plot of the two Shanghai movies.
No, not quite.
That's,
But anyways.
cowboys fighting knights
Yeah.
Sure.
would have been.
Anyway, I think that's about it. There's more details, and if you're interested, read it. We're going to post the
Post a
link to
link
this.
for sure.
But
Yes.
any final thoughts, gentlemen?
No, I mean, just again, the general aspect of it, as we said, is we all find quite interesting, and it is interesting to think about, even though, again, as we said, some of it may seem obvious. Nevertheless, just sort of be aware and realize how you're producing and constantly updating your own self-narrative and how it looks and affects those around you.
Yeah, the idea of the constantly changing personal story, personal narrative is fascinating, and there's a lot to look into within it. It seems like this. It seems like this is a good paper. I guess I'll have to read it.
You poser.
But from what I read, it from the small amount of it that I read, it was interesting. It doesn't matter. My excuses don't matter.
Tell a narrative about it.
I don't think
Later
your narrative has much cohesion, and I'm deeming it.
It doesn't matter because I think it does,
invalid.
and it's my own personal narrative. All that matters is
He's
what
giving
I
you
think.
negative audience feedback right now. But anyways.
I will take that as a social cue to update my personal narrative.
All right.
In the meantime, I will.
Until then.
I will stop talking now and turn it back over to the.
Yeah, I need a nap. So
Time to die.
He's getting cranky, folks.
Soon he'll be talking in movie theaters annoyingly. Go on.
I'm Jonathan Manzer here with Scott.
Tomorrow I'll be you.
See you, Ramosi.
Have a good night.
See you next time.
This has been the Neophytes of Narratology. We hope that you've experienced an epiphany or two of the literary nature, but only metaphorically, of course.
Editing and engineering by Jonathan Ian Manser. Music by Christopher Morgan. Check us out on YouTube and iTunes for the shows, and on Facebook and Twitter for updates.